Hello and welcome to our briefing video, which aims to bring you up to date with how we're getting started with our National Lottery Heritage Fund project, interpreting the Ffestiniog and Welsh Island railways and redeveloping Boston Lodge Works. This briefing will take about an hour. We've got quite a lot to pack into this video, and we hope that by the end of it you'll have a really good understanding of what it is we're trying to do and how far we have got so far. The National Lottery Heritage Fund project is the biggest single project that we've worked on since we completed the Welsh Highland Railway. It's going to be about a £4 million project, so that's quite a lot of money for us. And firstly, this project was billed largely as being about Boston Lodge Works and rebuilding the buildings there. And indeed, that does form quite a large part of the project. However, as we've worked with the Lottery Fund to develop our ideas, they were very keen to ask us to explore how we interpret the Ffestiniog and Welsh Island railways for our visitors. And this has become even more important with the news that the slate industry of North Wales should, if all goes well, become a World Heritage Site in the next year or so. And we're an important part of that. But the question is, how many people understand that? How do we tell the story? And so the Lottery Fund said, look at your business, think about what it is you're doing, and how can you do a better job of telling the story of the slate industry and the Ffestiniog and Welsh Highland railways to the 200,000 or more visitors each year that come to the railway. So that's what we're trying to do. It's an interpretation project that works on many different levels, and it's supported by a number of other activities and some capital buildings work that we need to do in order to keep the railway sustainable and thriving. So the question that's often asked about lottery funded projects, and indeed the National Lottery Heritage Fund will always ask this of you, and that is, why now? Why do you need to do this project at this time? And I'd like to answer that in our introduction here for our staff members and supporters. 2 or 3 years ago, we could sense that somehow we needed to look at our business and think what we were doing, how good a quality of product it was that we were delivering to our visitors, and also a feeling that we'd like to attract more of our visitors to actually join us, get involved, take an interest in the railway, and to be able to make sure that there's enough people involved in the railway for it to go on safely, sustainably into the future. But we felt that many of our visitors may come for a ride on the train and learn very little about the railway itself and its history, our heritage. What's going on behind the scenes? What are we doing? Who are the people that are working on it and why? And who's putting their money into it, supporting it, and why? So with that in our minds, we started working on various ideas about how we might improve the railway offer and how we tell our story. But as I'd said right at the beginning, the lottery people made us really think about that and think a bit more. Now, of course, everything has changed, and with COVID, our business simply has to change for the future. We know that we've got to make our business more profitable, that we've got to look after our resources very carefully, and we're going to have to work even harder at making sure that we bring in new members, volunteers and supporters. And so the Lottery Fund project will help us to do that. And it will start by making sure that every visitor to our railway, whether it's someone riding on the train, visiting our website, visiting a station, will get some information about our heritage and our history, with the hope that that then triggers an interest that makes them want to find out more. Our project will then go on to give ways in which we can get those people involved once we've triggered that interest. So, for example, one of our highlights of our programme is to have a tour behind the scenes of Boston Lodge Works, which tells more about our history and our heritage. It links in two things. One is about telling our story better, and second about redeveloping the works and protecting the historic buildings that we want to look after. So what this means is that of the 200,000 plus people that visit our railway each year, we will then be able to say to a handful of them, look, you want to know more? Come and find out more by coming on this tour. And so as they visitors and come to see Boston Lodge, they may get between 1 and 3 hours of a tour, which really gets a lot of information into their minds and gets them interested. If, when they've done that tour, and we're probably talking about something like about 10,000 people a year doing that tour at most, so 200,000 people visit, somewhere in the perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 range of people would actually do this tour and learn some more. And then if they are interested to do more than that, then we would hope to recruit them as members, give them tasters of how they could work with us as volunteers, and then give them a route through to becoming part of our organisation. There's other ways that we'll do that as well. For example, there'll be things like work experience, days where you can come along and learn particular skills. But it all hinges around doing what we've done well over the years, that is working together, staff and volunteers, but introducing more volunteers, improving the training and making sure that they've got the skills to get on and enjoy the work that they do with the railway. I would add as well, there's another dimension to the project which is all around skills and training, and we know there are certain things that heritage railways do, project management, managing the workshops and other areas where there's skills unique to our railway or to the heritage railway scene, and we'll be taking time to develop those skills as part of this project. So returning to the question, why now? Why do we need to do something now to interpret our railway? Well, I, like many of us, I think, can feel our history slipping through our fingers. It feels like picking up sand and feeling it trickling through your fingers sometimes. As generations move on, people that were with us, particularly at the beginning of the adventure to restore, our history disappears with those people if we're not careful. And if nobody talks about our history, if nobody remembers it, if nobody documents it, if nobody brings it to life, then quietly, our history slips away. And our railway is all about our history and our heritage, isn't it? And we want to keep that. It means a lot to us. So we need to do something to keep it alive. And that's in no small part what this project is about, is making sure a much wider audience, lots more people, understand the history of the railway and why it's important. And you know, that extends into the local community as well, because I know that many young people don't necessarily learn about the slate industry and the railway and its importance to the local area. And if we can do something there to remind the local community and to keep that history alive, then it will serve our railway well into the future. So that's it for the short update on the interpretation and Boston Lodge redevelopment project. If you would like to have more information, this video continues for around an hour. So grab a coffee and settle down and enjoy finding out more. You'll note that the video also has chapter tabs in the YouTube controls, so you don't have to sit and listen to this all at once. You can dip in and out to the sections that are of most interest to you. I'm going to say a few words now about our heritage and interpretation. Really what I want to be talking about is interpretation, which is part of the package of our lottery bid, but it's all totally interrelated with our history. Why do we want to interpret things? Why do we want to tell a story? It's so that our history and our heritage is not lost to the world. So a few moments on heritage first and foremost. Heritage, or history, gets condensed over time. So something that's here now, that's happening now, there'll be a lot of information about, but in just a few years' time, that information comes condensed to a few pages, then a few paragraphs, and maybe occasionally even just a sentence. It condenses over time. So if we think about our railway and the industry that it served, the two things are inextricably linked, and what people know of them today and what they knew a generation ago. Well, we can see that a pattern forms. So if we take, for example, something that we all know quite a lot about, and that's steam engines. We're a steam railway. A lot of people work with us because they like the steam engines. When something is commonplace and in use every day, everybody knows about those things, takes them for granted and so on. So back in the late 60s, when the end of steam came, we saw quite an interesting reaction to that. For many people, they were probably glad to see the back of dirty steam engines, hard working conditions, dirt, filth, things that weren't associated with modern life and the modern world. For some people, though, the end of steam engines was something that was really very sad and something that they spent a lot of time trying to remember and not let go. I guess over time, and 10 years on into the 1970s, we'd see that steam engines and the life that went with them probably had quite a rosy glow around them, where all the dirt and difficulties and costs were forgotten, and all the nice things, the pleasant moments associated with steam engines were remembered. Well, I suppose looking at the world through rose-coloured glasses, really. And then, as time goes on, the number of people who can remember steam engines day to day, the number of people who feel nostalgic about them drifts away. And right now in 2020, we're seeing that many people who have memory of steam engines action in Britain are now passing away, leaving us, and their memories are going. And so for new generations, how important are those steam engines? Not very, I suspect. But for those of us who care, then we want to make sure that the importance of those things are remembered. Let's think for a moment about Wales and the slate industry. We all know what those scars on the hillside are. We probably even have a soft spot for slate tips. We understand how the railway fits in with the environment, how it worked, how it connected the port and the mines. I think we probably carry a picture in our minds of the hard work that it took for those men to quarry out that slate and how difficult it was to build the dry stone walls upon which the railway runs. Now, many generations further on, many people don't even know what slate is. It's just a roof tile, isn't it? Where did it come from? A lot of people just wouldn't know. And so it wouldn't be long, actually, before those scars on the landscape, those marks, rather than being seen as something associated with a once great history, could just become a mark on the landscape. Who knows what it is? Who cares? So interpretation, telling the story, is all about keeping history alive. Now, I can't tell you why we are so interested in keeping history alive, why it's important to us. I just know it happens, and it is important to me. And probably by the fact that you're watching this briefing, it's important to you too. So we just have to accept that our history is important and we want to keep it alive. If we want to do that, we have to tell our story, we have to explain what our railway is about, what our history is all about. And that means now, in 2020, thinking about it in quite a different light, because we can't assume that people are fond of steam engines. We can't assume that people do know what a slate is. We can't assume that people have any idea of what kind of engineering goes on in order to maintain a railway. We can't even assume that people might understand what it takes to burn coal in the firebox of a steam engine. Nothing really can be taken for granted, and we have to tell our story. So with our interpretation plan, our intention is to try and tell a little bit of that story at every step along the way of a customer's journey or visit to us. And that may start with information on our website when people first inquire, the car park attendant having some knowledgeable insight into our history when people turn up at our railway, the people selling the tickets, the people working on the trains, the loco crews, buffet car staff and so on would all be expected to impart a little knowledge. So at every point in which our visitors touch us, then we would hope to tell part of the story. That can happen in many different ways, but primarily what we want to focus on is first-hand interpretation or first-person interpretation. So we want our people to tell the story. So much of our project with the Lottery Fund support is there to help us teach our people about our history and make sure that they have the skills and the props that they need to retell those stories to make sure they last down the years. And also, one important point is to try and get those stories as accurate as we reasonably can, or as factual as we reasonably can. Because I'm sure we've all heard stories that have been decanted from person to person over time, only to find that the story transmitted in the end bears little resemblance to the original truth. And that's another way in which our heritage can be lost to us, where true north, the real story, is lost. I think we're all guilty of that from time to time. I certainly am. And so, back to interpretation then, it's an important part of the plan. It's quite a lot of the effort and energy that we're putting into it, quite a lot of the spending is going into interpretation, and we'll see everybody, hopefully, getting involved in it in some way. But first and foremost, it's about people telling our stories. For those of you wondering where the backdrop is to this piece of filming, this is the waiting room in the new Windvower station building. We've combined two tasks. One is doing this filming and the other is one of our security checks to check that our buildings are all right during lockdown. In this section of our briefing, I want to talk just for a moment or two about training and our activity plans associated with our National Lottery Heritage Fund project. Prior to this National Lottery project, we've had a previous project, the Skills for the Future project, where 20 trainees have spent a year with us learning basic skills related to heritage and heritage railways in particular. This scheme, which was a £440,000 project, has had a really strong effect on our railway. We've taught some people some skills that we knew were missing. Some of those people have gone on to work for us. Some have gone to work for other railways and other heritage establishments, and others have gone on to further education. So it's been a really successful thing. And when we looked at what we did in that scheme, the Skills for the Future scheme, we did foundation level training. So people with limited knowledge of railways and heritage came to us, and we gave them a grounding for a year in the basics. And that's worked very well. When we came to look at our next project, we realised that there was always something missing, always something where we've got a gap in our knowledge. Interpretation is one of those areas. Project management, volunteer management, and the ability to run something, say, like the administration of a workshop like Boston Lodge or the infrastructure department, say. These are very different skills to those you find in mainstream industries these days. They're quite specialised. Particularly with project management, whenever we go to run complex projects, finding somebody with both project management skills and some knowledge of heritage, well, the people are out there, but there's just not enough of them. So as part of this project, we'll have trainees working alongside our skilled staff, learning these disciplines, in the hope that they may work for us again in the future, or go to work for other heritage organisations and bring those important skills to bear. An important part of this is volunteering. We know that the volunteers that are presented to us these days have a really different range of skills to those of 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, for example, it's really quite unlikely that somebody will turn up at our door who is a skilled machinist during the day and fancies doing a bit more of that stuff at the weekend as a volunteer. It would also be the same in our infrastructure department. Don't get many people who are dry stone wallers or skilled P-way people wanting to come and spend their weekends with us. There are some, but there's not enough. And in years gone by, the skills that we could hope to pick up and use, they just don't come as a result of people's work in mainstream industry. So we have to train those skills in, and that means teaching our volunteers a lot more than perhaps we had to in the past. I say this, and I often quote the example of something as simple as lighting a fire. 50 years ago, everybody would know how to light a fire because it's how you heated your home. These days, very few people do. In fact, burning anything in your house is probably going to be a non-starter in years to come for environmental reasons. But when it comes to the practical work on the railway, knowing things like that, lighting a fire, how to wield a broom, how to hold a shovel, things like this are really important, and they're not there. So with our training, we have to understand that we must go back a step to give the foundations to our volunteers to enable them to thrive and move on. And we can do that, we're good at it, but we need to do a lot more of it. And so our focus, or one of our foci in the project, will be making sure that we equip volunteers with the skills and we take the time to help them learn, to track their learning, and make sure we've got the right people with the right skills to do the jobs that we need done safely. Not only that, but also we realise that managing volunteers on the ground, particularly while they're visiting our sites, is really important, and we need to put a lot more resource into that. We need to kickstart that, restart that process. And that's something that the Lottery Fund project will help us to do. So we are allowing in there for people, A, to teach volunteers and to organise skills training, but B, to also organise a work programme for those volunteers to get them started. We hope that the new volunteers that we encourage as a result of this programme will then go on to be project leaders, project managers in their own right, and hopefully, who knows, end up running the place in years to come. The old engine shed is located at the very eastern end of the Boston Lodge site. It's very important as a building in that it was the first locomotive shed built to house the first 2-foot gauge steam locomotives. The shed itself is perhaps not particularly special in its own right, but because the locomotives that it was built to house still exist and much of its fabric is original, particularly the old inspection pits, it really does become a special package when all of those things are put together. And this was recognised by CADU, who gave us a grant to help its restoration, supported by a number of other legacies some years back. Not only does the loco shed have a place in our hearts because of its long history dating back to the beginning of steam operations, but also these engine shed doors were the ones that the volunteers opened in the early 1950s to find the Ffestiniog railway sleeping, mothballed, where all the locos were. Locos in a fairly dilapidated state, it has to be said. But nonetheless, you can imagine the magic of opening those doors and finding the old engines inside, with the shafts of light shining down into the gloom on the locomotives. The loco shed is in reasonably good condition, needs some repairs to its doors and sills, which have suffered since the last overhaul over 10 years ago, but will quickly be put in good order. Looking to the future, we intend to make a visit to the old loco shed the finale of the Boston Lodge tour. And not only will it be the last place on the tour, but also we will use it to continue our operations. So it will continue to maintain its character as a loco shed by having locos and other items of rolling stock stored there, which change from time to time as operations dictate. But in the far end of the shed, where the workshop used to be, and the workshop was featured in one of the Bleasdale photographs that I'm sure you'll be familiar with, we can recreate that space. And indeed, pictures dating back to the 1930s show the dividing wall between the workshop and the engine shed, which we hope to reinstate as part of this project. Indeed, the top half of it still exists inside the shed. We also have some really useful exhibits that we can show, because back in the closure period, or just before, any visit to the engine shed would have presented you with both locomotives that were working and dismantled locomotives. As it happens, we have some great examples there that we can use. So, for example, Princess will find a natural home in this shed, as will the carcass of Welsh Pony, the old parts of Welsh Pony in a dismantled state, which will allow people to look at what a loco looks like when it's in bits, see inside and to ask questions. So that's the old loco shed. The building that we know today as Plas Smart was originally the superintendent's office in the top yard at Boston Lodge. It was part of the range of buildings which went all along the eastern end of the top yard and was demolished, sadly, in the 1950s or early 60s. Largely, leaving just the superintendent's office at the end, known as Plas Smart because Ian Smart used to stay there. The building had fallen into disrepair in recent years. It was actually quite difficult to find the funds to do the work necessary on it, but this was eventually carried out, including some extra work on stabilising the retaining wall at the back, the main wall at the back, which has the earth from the sandpit site mounded up against it. This building rarely seems to feature in old photographs of the top yard. The photograph that we're showing here has it tucked away behind a curly roof van. You can just see the top of the porch and the chimney in the background there. This building has been restored but doesn't have a floor in it as yet and needs some extra work doing to the porch, etc. on the outside, and will be a feature of the restored top yard, although we have yet to identify a specific use for it, as it's quite a small area inside, but no doubt we'll find some good use for it. But its exterior is very important, as it is giving the line to the rest of the buildings that will be recreated along that edge of the top yard. Building H2 is the blacksmith shop. This is one of the oldest buildings on the site, and as its name suggests, it has been used for forging various items over the years, and generally speaking for hot work of all types. It has had quite a varied history and is a fascinating mix of parts of buildings that have been recycled. So the front wall is different to the back wall. It's got various different roof beams, chimneys, and so on. Following many years of very limited use, where it was mainly used as a store and was so full that it was very difficult to access, it became apparent that this building was in a terrible state, and particularly the roof. A couple of years back, when there was a storm that raged to 100-mile-an-hour winds, I had the chance to go in there. Just during the storm, I had to check the place out, and the roof was literally lifting up off the rafters and dropping back down again. This, by that time, was a tin roof on the rear-facing portion of it. And I had to get out there quickly because I didn't think that the building would survive the storm. It did, just about. So it was in a bad state, and we have since, with the help of the Society, spent over £100,000 rescuing the shell of this building, re-roofing it and replacing the chimneys. It's been a very positive piece of work, a very good contribution to Boston Lodge. And now we're in a situation where this building will be used, following some extra fitting out, it will be used for hot work again, forging work, blacksmithing type work, the kind of work that would support the maintenance of slate wagons and other similar historic items, and will be particularly focused on volunteer input and skills training. So this area will be at the heart of the NLHF programme. It will need to be fitted out to a small degree to enable this work to take place. and will be extended. There'll be an extension building just to the east of it, more of which later. And at the same time, the small shed known as the Britomart shed, which existed before that space, should once again be capable of holding a Quarry Hunslet or stabling a Quarry Hunslet loco. The oil store building, or the old oil store building, is marked up as building H3 on our plans and is in the western corner of the yard, the top yard. Again, one of the older buildings on the site. Not very well recognised as one of the buildings, or not a standout building, I think it's fair to say, in recent years, because it's been used as a store for telecoms equipment, and adjacent to it there was built in the late 70s a separate building for a telephone exchange. In the redevelopment work of Boston Lodge, the telephone exchange building from the 70s will be carefully removed to reveal once more the faces of building H3, the old oil store, and also the easterly corner of the brass foundry. So this will restore the yard to something like the image shown, which is the first of the old images accompanying this. Often you can see that people have taken photographs of the yard, but the old oil store gets clipped off. Only part of the building shows. So in these three images, you can see it just to the right-hand side of the first image. On the second image, you can see a locomotive passing the old wall, which used to wall off the top yard, and just behind it you can see the roof line of the old oil store. And then finally there's an image from 1948 taken from Pen Cobb looking up the line, and you can see just the back of this building behind Boston Lodge Cottages, number 1 and 2. So now this building, which is very narrow, will become the centrepiece of the IT at Boston Lodge. So there needs to be a place for a limited number of servers, connection points for cables coming in and out of the site, and some other IT equipment. So they will be located in this building, and it will also have a lavatory in it, which will be an accessible lavatory, which can be used by visitors to the site. If Boston Lodge could be said to be the heart of the Ffestiniog and Welsh Island Railways, then perhaps the brass foundry is the heart of Boston Lodge. This store has been used as a store now for over 60 years and contains artefacts going right back to the very first use of steam engines on the railway in 1863. That's right, there's parts of the original England engines stored in here. And since then, many other important parts of locomotives, which are generally not required now, are stored here, ready should we need them at some time in the future. And indeed, this store has proved very helpful indeed in the recent restoration of Welsh Pony, where many of its original parts, or certainly parts from other England engines, were there and were able to be used. So this building, being so characterful, is going to be retained pretty much as is. We will take out all the equipment that's inside it and carefully store it and label it, and there may be some rationalisation of what is kept, because there are some things which were put in there because they were how shall we say, seemed to be a beneficial purchase at the time, but actually aren't. So we'll do some rationalisation, rebuild the building so that it's got a good long-term future, and then put all of this old stuff back inside so that people can continue to enjoy the character of the building, the character of what's kept in it, and all the items that are on the shelves. And of course, being a working building, the chances are that we'll draw upon this store for other restorations in the future. The iron foundry, also known to many of us as the number 2 machine shop from the 70s and 80s. This building is also a very old building, and from the outside most people just walk past it on their way into the works. On the inside these days you would recognise it as a store, and in fact it's one of those stores which has got all sorts of glorious bits of equipment which are bound to come in useful one day. Which bits are going to be useful and which are not is a big question mark, but it does characterise Boston Lodge and what the place is or has been like. So our intention with this building is to carefully take out all of the stores that are in there, to get rid of the things that we don't need, and then to reinstate some of the shelving around the edges, which is wonderful old Boston Lodge shelving in places, it's got character, and put the stores that we do need back in here, but creating a little more space as we go so that people who are entering that building can look at it and understand the building and what it was all about. Its history, of course, was as the iron foundry, and there was a cupola in there which was used to melt iron for casting purposes. So I'm guessing they would have made things like brake blocks and other pieces of ironwork, say for track components and the like. Indeed, anything that we've got old patterns for. So this will be very much a working building, won't necessarily be part of a Boston Lodge Works tour, but anybody venturing in there would be able to understand what had happened in there historically, but will continue to be used as a store. But the building will be restored to some degree so that it has a much safer future. But this is just a simple picture of a puddle in the top yard, you might say. But we're using this image simply to illustrate the point that there's a lot of work to go on underground as we go through the Boston Lodge project, and also to deal with the surfaces around the yards, which have got quite degraded over some time. So there's a lot to deal with. Drains which will be put in to connect with the drainage systems that were installed in earlier phases of the Boston Lodge project. There's a big job to be done with ducting and sorting out the electricity supply to the works, which also goes under the top yard. But then the chances are that we'll simply put in a good sub-foundation and skim it over with this slate waste in much the way we have in the past, as doing it in any other way is likely to change the character of the yard, and that's something that we're keen very much not to do. So we won't be looking at tarmac or paving, but rather just going back to the original slate waste. And of course, if we do damage that, it's easy enough to repair as long as all the underpinning surfaces and drains are sorted out properly. So that's the surfaces in the yard. Quite a large amount to be spent here, but very important to the overall project. The eastern side of the yard had a row of buildings that leaned up against the rock face of the old quarry that forms Boston Lodge. Indeed, to save money, the back wall of the quarry also formed the back wall of these buildings. A very interesting method of construction, and I'm sure these were very damp places. Those buildings lasted a long time. They were used as the Waggon repair shops in the very early days of the railway, and have always formed part of the enclosed top yard, which is very characterful. And as you can see in the old pictures, they defined the top yard, and now with them demolished, the top yard feels very different indeed. So whilst we will have to retain the roadway into the top yard for vehicular access, the intention is to recreate the rest of that range of buildings from the roadway towards where the waste and incinerator is at the moment. This area was excavated some years ago to find out what lay beneath, and we found various pieces of older track dating back right to the 1860s. That has now been blinded over and protected. And indeed, it seemed that what the railway did in those days was, if the track wasn't in the right place, they would blind it over with waste and lay some extra track on top. So what we intend to do is to recreate this range of buildings, and in doing so, recreate the character of the yard as it was before those buildings were demolished back in the early 60s. The photographs here show the buildings in a terrible state, with the slates all slipped off, the beams exposed and so on. And in one of these images you can see slate wagons, wooden slate wagons, being burnt in the top yard to release their wheel sets and other metal items for scrap, no doubt, which is very sad indeed. But it reflects how the buildings and some of the old equipment was little valued at that time. I think it's fair to say that's not a criticism, it's just that they were little valued, and so they went. But if we can recreate this building, then we can recreate the character of the top yard, and that's something that I think we would all enjoy, and it would help to tell the story of the very early Boston Lodge much better. As it happens, we have a real need for these buildings to act as a goods inward and storage area for materials coming into the works. And also we can create a space here which we can use for the induction of visitors who are coming to the site for the Boston Lodge Works Tour. So we can talk to them sheltered from the rain if need be. So that's the buildings on the eastern side of the yard, the Waggon Shed, building number H9. The Georgian barracks at Boston Lodge, which most of us know as number 1 and 2 Boston Lodge cottages, are the oldest buildings on the site, dating back to the construction of the cob. They have reportedly been derelict at times and then rebuilt and reused, and have been used as residences for quite some time now. But they are in a very poor state indeed, and I think we would all agree that they are the image of Boston Lodge that most people have in their mind from driving across the cob, be it either on the road or by train. Those white cottages stand out as being Boston Lodge. So the time has come to carry out major conservation work on this building. It needs a new roof, much work on the fabric, floors, rewiring. In fact, you name it, it needs to be done. So we have to completely strip this building. And in the sequence of events as planned at the moment, it will probably be one of the last buildings to be attended to. And when complete, this building will have its original facade restored, albeit without the stables that were in the front gardens, and it will be used for operational offices, largely upstairs, and there will still be 2 small residential flats to allow for accommodation on site, because we feel that for security purposes it's good to have a presence on site at all times. So that's H10, that's the Georgian barracks, oldest buildings on the site. We're now moving to look at 3 buildings together, as their reconstruction and conservation will see significant change in use around the yard at Boston Lodge. The first building to look at is the Den, which was built in the late 1970s as a memorial to Ron Garraway, Alan Garraway's father. This building is now probably life expired, not because of the nature of the fabric of the building, but because of the size, the layout of it, and how it doesn't really fit the modern day needs of the works. So this building will be completely demolished, and in its place, part of its footprint will be replaced with an electrician's workshop. There's also some other things in this area, including some plant necessary for modern heating and cooling of buildings. But it needs to be looked at also alongside these other buildings. So the first one of those to look at is what we currently would generally see as the oil store, which is a building that historically was actually the sawmill. It's the front half of the sawmill decapitated. So the sawmill was really quite a long building which occupied the place that the oil store now stands in and where the den that's to be demolished now stands. So a long, thin building was there. Then we look at the building next to it, which we refer to as H14, variously known as the old den and old works offices and so on. But this building is currently used as the electrician's workshop. In future, what will happen is this building will be used as the den once more. It has a wonderful aspect looking out over the yard and over the cob. So what better place to sit and have your brew or your lunch and relax between tasks. So a good space for a den. Adjacent to it, in the oil store building, will be toilets and washrooms, expanded quite considerably over what we have at this time. And then, as I'd said previously, going back to the where the den is now, that will then become an electrician's workshop. Over the old sawmill site, and indeed over the new toilets and washrooms, will be an upstairs area which will do two things. One is it gives us space for a plant room, it gives us some extra storage office space up there, but also importantly it restores the roof line of the buildings at Boston Lodge. And we can see that looking at H14, the old den as it is today, clearly the roof there had been cut off, and it looks like it had been cut off rather than merging into the roof of the old sawmill. So that roof line will return, and these three buildings together will cover the kind of use we've been using for them in the last few years, with the exception of the oil store, which will move away to the engine shed. So it will cover these jobs, but the layout will be considerably different from what it is now. You'll notice on the plans there's quite a lot of locker space in here, which is something which requires a lot of attention. Locker and changing rooms are an important part of Boston Lodge, and we're trying to find sufficient space for them. Glanamore Yard will be the site of a new locomotive shed. It's called the National Lottery Heritage Fund Small Locomotive Shed. The objective of this shed is to house the collection of locomotives that have come to be at the Ffestiniog Railway over the years. And often these engines are not needed for mainstream services. As we know, those are regularly covered by the double fairlies and the garrets. But nonetheless, they're a very important part of the Ffestiniog Railway scene. For much of the time, these locomotives cannot be seen by visitors or members of the public, although they would really like to be able to see them. After all, people come to heritage railways in no small part to see locomotives. So the idea of this shed is that the small locomotives, when out of service, can be stored here and accessed by the general public. I say accessed by the general public, that would only be on guided organised tours. So it won't be an open facility, but it's just one where we can show people our locomotives as part of a tour as we see fit. It will also allow us to put some interpretation panels and the like in there to explain each locomotive and its history, which is always useful when showing people around. This site has changed dramatically over the years, as the historic pictures show. Only one small part of the pair of carriage sheds that were in this area still survives, right at the back of the current loco shed. And This will probably be carefully dismantled and the materials within used to build other buildings on the site, such as the Waggon repair shed. This won't be the only loco shed at Boston Lodge. There are two more to follow. One is the garret shed and the other is the main running shed. But those two sheds are not part of the NLHF project. They come as later phases in Boston Lodge development. So just to recap, that the small loco shed is for the storage of locos. It will be possible to operate locos from there, and there is an inspection pit and there is fume extraction to allow locomotives to be lit up. However, its primary role will be storage and access to the small locomotives in our collection. The area in the top yard next to the blacksmith shop has had many different buildings on it over the years. And even more recently, there was the old tunnel mess taken from the site near the Molwyn Tunnel, brought down into the top yard and used as an S&T workshop. And it's only within the last 10 years that that building has gone. So now there is an opportunity to improve the look of the top yard and to recreate one of the historic buildings that appeared on this site. And in terms of future use, we need to have a meeting room and a training facility and a place where we can carry out our research into the history of Boston Lodge. So this will be the location that we have planned for this. So the blacksmith's shop extension building will be a clean training facility that we can use as part of our project. Adjacent to it, through glazed doors, will be the replacement for the Britomart shed, and you should be able to see through that into the blacksmith shop itself. So people working in the blacksmith shop can see people in the training and research room and vice versa. This building will take the form of one of the buildings that was here historically, most likely built with a timber frame and clad with corrugated iron in much the way that you see in these old photographs. So turning now to thinking about what work we've actually completed in the National Lottery Heritage Fund project so far, we've actually covered quite a lot of ground. We started with a master plan for Boston Lodge, which we've now built upon with our interpretation plan. So we have an idea of all the things that we want to do. And this was mapped out in our initial application to the Lottery Fund, which was accepted. Over at Boston Lodge, of course, prior to this project, we'd done quite a lot of work to put in things like the access road, the sewage systems and drainage around the yard that will tee into the project that we're working on now. But also, we put a lot of effort into building the carriage sheds and the storage sheds around the perimeter of the site, which allow us to store things out the way and get at the buildings which are at the core of the site that we now want to work on. The next stage after this has been to work on the development phase. This is where we take our ideas that we put into the project at the initial application and build them up so that we've got a really good idea of what we're doing and what it's going to cost. And in doing that, we have the support of many consultants and advisors that help us to get the whole project together to the satisfaction of the Lottery Fund, who set a very high target. So that's going on now, the development stage. We're about halfway through that. We had a thing called the midterm review in December with an objective of then submitting our application in the spring. But as you can imagine, with COVID and all the challenges that has brought, we will be a little bit behind in our timing. In fact, we've rescheduled now so that we expect to make our round 2 application with all the necessary detail by somewhere like the end of May that's when we're aiming for. So a lot of work to go on though between now and then, with the consultants taking their programme or their ideas and plans forward to a level known as Rebirth Stage 2, something that those of you who've worked in the world of architecture and buildings will be familiar with. But in essence, this is where we've got a very clear picture of what it is that we need to do, and really good quotes and costings for that work. It also means that we will have a really good sequence of works, that we know what we are going to do when. Now I'm holding up now our current version of our phasing plan. So once we have got all of our plans, and this is the plans for interpretation, the plans for training, job descriptions, plans for the trainees, how we recruit them, how we'll look after them, and then there's the building works, sequencing of the building works, marketing work, how we're going to promote the project, who's going to do that, what's the plan, what will it cost. All of these things we're now tying together into a bundle, which we can then hand to the lottery fund as our second round bid. Huge piece of work, and to put it in perspective, the cost of getting from the first round, where we go into the development phase, through to the second round bid is about £200,000. 150,000 of that comes from the lottery fund, £50,000 funded by the Ffestiniog Railway Society, for which we are very grateful indeed. So that's it. We'll complete the development phase, we'll make our submission, and then we'll be in a position where we're sitting waiting to hear what the lottery funds say, and hopefully in the autumn of 2021 we might get to hear whether we've got the go-ahead to work on this project or not. I'll now move on to a conclusion, just to wrap up what it is that's in the project, just so you leave this briefing with a clear idea of what it's all about. It's been a fairly long briefing, and if you've stayed with us this long, thank you for doing that. There's a lot of information in here, a lot of detail, and I'm happy just to bring it all together for you now. In conclusion, this is the biggest project since we completed the Welsh Highland Railway. The project aims to keep our heritage alive, not letting it slip through our fingers, by telling our story clearly and effectively. We have an activity plan in the project that will retain and develop really important skills for our railway. We will create opportunities for people to engage with us from a much wider range of backgrounds, so more people can be involved with us. Volunteers are absolutely vital to our project, and this project will bring opportunities both in terms of work programmes for volunteers and also training opportunities, so those key skills that we need to be able to do jobs on the railway properly are trained in an effective way. We have an ambitious conservation and building plan for Boston Lodge to give us the buildings that we need to support our work on interpretation, our work with volunteers, and our work with training. And we will put our heritage centre stage again, right the way through our customer journey, from the first contact that people have with us, through the time that they spend with us and beyond, using both physical and digital means. Also, we will be at the very heart of the World Heritage Site that is the slate industry of North Wales, which will bring us more opportunities for visitors and more people joining the railway. So now we're looking for your feedback as a result of watching this video and as a result of all the documentation, articles in magazines and the like, but we're looking for your feedback to help shape our project so we get it right, so it fits well for all of us as we go forward to that second round application to the National Lottery Heritage Fund.